Well, it's officially afternoon, so I can say good afternoon and welcome to the fourth annual Expanded Access 101 webinar presented by the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, also known as CUPA. We will be offering live Spanish translation for today's event, so if you would like to enable it, please select Interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom screen now. CUPA is a working group with the NYU Grossman School of Medicine, Division of Medical Ethics, housed in NYU Langone's Department of Population Health. CUPA's mission is to advance research, policy, and education regarding the ethical issues surrounding access to investigational medical products. Our theme for today's webinar is very practical: empowerment through education. And that's exactly what we are setting out to do today. We welcome you all, patients and patient advocates, clinicians, industry members, trialists, academics, regulators, and I'm sure many others. We hope you will leave today with a better understanding of what expanded access is, what it is not, and how you can make the best use of this important pathway. Because our time today is limited, we will be sending some important information and reminders for today's webinar via the chat, so keep an eye out there. There will be a moderated Q&A session at the end of today's event, so please prepare your questions and submit them via the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer them. Now, personally, it's my pleasure to be with you today. My name is Christopher Robertson. I'm a professor of law at Boston University, where we have a historic health law program. I'm a member of CUPA, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'll begin by doing a quick overview of some of the basics of expanded access. And so in that context, we start with really the idea of investigational medical products. And here we're talking about drugs, devices, sometimes tests. And within the drug space, we're talking about both small molecule and large molecule biologics that are still under investigation. They haven't yet been approved by a regulatory authority, which in the US would be the FDA, which is to say that they are experimental, they're unapproved, or we can call this the pre-approval space. Although, of course, that's hopeful that a given product ever will be approved, because since it's being investigated, we're still trying to figure out if it is safe and effective for its intended purposes. And so typically these products are still in clinical trials, and those involve typically randomization to a placebo, a product that allows us to estimate causal efficacy, holding all other things constant. We have here the image of the clinical trial phases, culminating in the phase 3 pivotal trial that typically is used to get FDA approval for the indication. And then phase 4 continues afterwards for additional studies. So historically, clinical trials have been the main way and the safe way and the useful way to access investigational products before they come approved on the market. But the question for today is, what if a patient cannot enroll in a clinical trial? Perhaps the clinical trial is full. Perhaps the clinical trial is finished. Perhaps the clinical trial is not running in your geographic area, or perhaps you have a comorbidity or other exclusion factor that prevents you from qualifying the specific trial. Or finally, perhaps you seek to use a drug for a different purpose than the one that's being tested in the clinical trial. So those, among others, are reasons why the clinical trial process, although it is the backbone of pre-approval access, might not work for everyone. So decades ago, now nearly 50 years ago, the FDA started formalizing a process for allowing what we call expanded access, or sometimes it's referred to as compassionate use of pre-approval products. And this process involves an application to the FDA. It can be either on an individual basis or on a cohort of patients through a group protocol. And typically the research shows that the FDA approves greater than 99.0% of the requests to proceed. But sometimes the FDA will ask further questions, make sure the patient has considered other alternatives. And partly the FDA does that because they have a view on all the products that are going through the clinical trial process. In more recent years, the FDA has worked to streamline this process and create an emergency pathway so it can be done simply with a phone call and often approved in a matter of hours as needed. So recently, however, Congress passed another law, which is called the Federal Right to Try Act. And it's useful to understand both the expanded access program and the right to try pathway sort of in juxtaposition to each other. So that's the way I will present it. Now, in that process, first of all, I want to emphasize that the main purpose of the Right to Try Act, as the sponsors will explain, is to get the FDA out of the picture. So while the FDA is central to the expanded access program, under the Federal Right to Try Act, the FDA just receives reports after the fact in aggregate data. So it's really not part of the prospective process of approving access. The second difference is that under the Expanded Access Program, an IRB, an Institutional Review Board, has a role to assure that both the informed consent process is robust and that this is a reasonable risk for the patient. That is also cut out of the Right to Try Act, or at least it's not required under the Right to Try Act. A second difference is the Expanded Access Program is completely flexible. It'll allow access in theory to drugs that are not even in clinical trials yet, or drugs that are no longer in active clinical development, and drugs that are in phase 1, whereas the Right to Try Act is somewhat narrower and does not apply to drugs that have not cleared phase 1 trials, which are what's necessary to get an estimate of toxicity and dosage. You'll also see the expanded access pathway is somewhat broader in applying to both serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions, where the Right to Try Act only applies to life-threatening diseases or conditions. So you could think of some debilitating diseases or other chronic illnesses that the expanded access program could apply to, a Right to Try would not. But what we really need to emphasize is under both of these pathways, both a doctor is necessary and the drug manufacturer has to agree to even provide their product under these programs. So that's what they continue to have in common. So that's one reason that the phrasing of right to try can sometimes be misleading, because you really can't access this product unless a doctor and drug maker agree under either pathway. But one difference is that the Right to Try program has attempted to give some liability protection for doctors, even if they negligently recommend a product, or for companies, even if they negligently provide a product to a patient for whom it's really not a good match. So in theory, you might think that companies and doctors would prefer the Right to Try program, but in practice, as some of our speakers will explain, we mostly see them continuing to prefer to work with the FDA and work with the IRBs to assure that these are, in fact, reasonable choices for patients if they offer either pathway at all. So just in closing, I'd say, I think there are 4 key principles to pre-approval access. And the first one, proof before profit, is written right into the statutes and regulations that either of these pathways are not a vehicle to make money on a drug. Companies have to either give it away for free, or they can get reimbursed for some of the costs of manufacturing or shipping or monitoring the product in this setting. So this is really not a way to get to market. And that's one reason that you don't see all companies doing it. The second key principle is that we can't divert patients out of clinical trial into one of the other pathways, because recall the clinical trial is the way to get to market, is the way to prove safety and efficacy. So then you can achieve a scale and a level of investment necessary to really affect public health. So these 2 pathways remain on the side of clinical trials, and we design these pathways to avoid diverting patients. Of course, the third and fourth principles are essential to all healthcare and research, is that we have to make sure we're giving these products to patients when it's reasonable to do so, in light of their other treatment alternatives and in light of their chances of proceeding without the drugs. And just to emphasize, when we say reasonable, this is a space where we actually don't know much about the safety and efficacy of the product. So it's hard to assess reasonableness. And finally, informed consent. And one of the challenges there is to make sure that the patients understand that this product is not proven safe and effective. It's not necessarily going to help, and it may well could hurt. So those are sort of some of the ethical framework we can use to approach these questions. Now, with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. We have Cláudia Hirawat with us. She is the owner and executive chair of VOZ Advisors. Until 2015, she was president of PTC Therapeutics. She volunteers with Eurodis, the Rare Diseases Europe, in international activities promoting the inclusion of the needs of patients with rare diseases in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030. She also serves as adjunct faculty in NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Division of Medical Ethics, and she's going to share with us some of the hurdles for patients considering expanded access. Cláudia?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. I'm speaking in general terms about the challenges that patients face in this process. Imagine a hypothetical situation where you have a serious or life-threatening disease for which there are no treatment options, and you don't qualify for the clinical trial. You attempt to join, but maybe you don't meet the inclusion criteria. You've heard of the term compassionate use, so you ask your physician about it. You look at the website of the company developing the investigational drug, and you're left with more questions. You're coming to your first hurdles. For the next slide, please. The knowledge or awareness of these programs, even the very terminology between compassionate use and the difference for expanded access. Patients are often unaware of these opportunities, and physicians are often unaware as well. Companies will post policies on websites, but they can be difficult to find and they're often vague. They're required by law, if they're developing a product, to have the policy on the website, but oftentimes they say they are prioritizing the clinical trials, they're encouraging people to try to enroll, and they're open to inquiries from physicians only, and they say they will get back to you within 5 days. These are all legal requirements. But there is no real detail about a plan for expanded access. Physicians are often unclear about these mechanisms and may be hesitant to reach out to a company for more information. There may not be somebody available at a company to provide general information as well. You're getting to your second level of hurdles on the next slide. The procedures themselves, the companies accept inquiries only by the physician. So there isn't necessarily someone available to answer your questions and explain the process. Similarly, for the physician, that can be just fill out this application, but not much of an explanation of what the process looks like. Companies are not usually very transparent about the decision-making criteria. So the physician may not receive any information about what is being taken into account, what would make a difference in considering a patient. It can be a little bit of a blind effort. And the review process can be lengthy. They say they get back to you in 5 days for the initial inquiry, but the review process can take quite some time. Getting to some additional challenges on the next slide. Some programs may provide you access, assuming you navigated all these first challenges and you are successful in securing access, but the drug company or your insurance might not cover other associated costs, such as hospitalization or access to other treatments necessary to receive the treatment drug. And if there is a negative decision, there isn't usually a mechanism to appeal that is spelled out, that you understand what can you do in that instance. The reasons for the denial can be vague. Companies sometimes will just say that they are unable to provide it at this time and not give you much specificity about what the issue is. And to aggravate things, you might hear in the community of someone with a similar profile to yours that received access and be unable to understand what was the difference. So I have a bit of a wish list of what we would like to see from companies on the next slide. And I just want to say, companies are not making this difficult because they just don't care. That's not the issue. This is important to them as well. There is a lack of information in companies as well about these mechanisms, a lack of understanding of the opportunities that they can bring, some misconceptions that the risk is too great, but several companies, primarily large pharmaceutical companies, have very well-established processes where this works really well. But what we'd like to see in general is that the policy would be easily located in the websites and up to date, mentioning existing programs so that anyone who can access it can know what is or isn't available. Posting those programs also on clinicaltrials.gov and in the Expanded Access Navigator of the Reagan-Udall Foundation. having personnel available to answer questions from patients and physicians, transparent and consistent information regarding criteria, process, costs, and reasons for denial if applicable. I emphasize consistent because of this issue about how patients will be treated across the board, being the need to have the same standards. And a mechanism to appeal a negative decision in case it is appropriate based on the nature of denial. I think these efforts would make things a lot better. Especially in biotech companies, having a strategy for pre-approval drug access, thinking about this early on and communicating openly with the community will make a very big difference for patients. Thank you. Back to you, Chris.
Well, thank you so much, Cláudia. I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Kay Holcombe. I'll mention that these next two speakers don't have slides. I'll be taking down the screen share, so you don't have to be wondering if you're missing something. We get to focus just on the speakers themselves. Ms. Holcombe has served as senior advisor to the Milken Institute, focusing on the Linda and Stuart Resnick Center for Public Health. She was senior vice president for science policy at BIO, which is the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. And she has extensive experience in governmental health policy and the nonprofit sector. She received a master's in science and chemistry, graduated with honors from the University of Virginia, and was elected Phi Beta Kappa, Phi Kappa Phi, and Iota Sigma Pi. So with that, I will welcome Kay Holcombe to the podium virtually.
Thank you, Chris, and hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. I want to talk to you a little bit about my perceptions over the years, and I've had worked for many years in this area of expanded access, which once upon a time was called compassionate use, to try to understand the process better and try to help patients understand it better. As Cláudia already has pointed out, this can be a rather arcane system with arcane processes. And I want to talk a few minutes about my perceptions of the things that large pharmaceutical companies are thinking about when their developmental compound that they are working on and trying to get through the FDA regulatory process and other regulatory processes around the world, when they see the need and hear the buzz about the need for one of these research compounds that they're working on, and what they think about when they consider making those research compounds available outside of the very well-controlled process of their clinical trials. And I want to say, and I echo the words of Cláudia here at the very beginning, to say that one reason that I don't like the terminology compassionate use is that it sort of sends this signal that if a company does not make its product available, it is not compassionate, which is completely and utterly not true of the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, I think over the last probably 10 years plus, companies have been engaging more and more and in greater depth in what we call patient-centric drug development, namely listening to patients, understanding their disease, understanding what they need and what they want. And this is all driven by the fact that companies are in this business because they have because they are compassionate toward patients who need therapies for their conditions. So the first thing that companies, I think, worry about is the impact of making the product available outside of their clinical trials on the clinical trials themselves. So if you have willingness, and there are a large number of patients who are receiving expanded access, is this going to mean that a smaller number of people are going to be interested in enrolling in your phase 3 clinical trial, which you have to complete before you get FDA approval for your new product? Because within a clinical trial, as you know, some patients do not receive the drug. Some patients are in the control group. And if they want to receive the drug and that's all they want, they do not want to enroll in a clinical trial. Companies are also concerned with respect to their clinical trials about the fact that when they allow access outside of the trial, they basically are losing control. The company is not in charge anymore of how the doctor uses the drug, what the doctor does with any information gained, such as adverse events, how they can do all of this within their clinical trials, because they vet all of the clinical investigators, they set out the protocol, the requirements, and everyone does it that way. That's not necessarily true with expanded access. And companies are concerned that once they lose that control, they also might be placing patients at risk. Secondly, because expanded access is technically available to patients at any phase of the development of a drug, and Chris illustrated the 4 phases to you, even after phase 1, patients can request access. But the company has very little information about the safety of the drug after phase 1. And they are concerned that patients who have this disease and have not been exposed to this drug, have not been screened to receive this drug, may be placed at greater risk than exists for them now without receiving the drug at all. They are very concerned about placing patients at risk who already are very ill and at very great risk. And patients will say, I don't really care, I want this drug anyway. The companies have to think carefully about how they do this, how they let go of this experimental compound about which they know very little at this point. And remember that by the time companies get to the point where they are having trials, clinical trials that involve sick patients, they are fairly well along the line of things that they need to do. And they are screening those patients very carefully, so they know who's in the trial. They don't know very much at all about patients whose doctors are requesting expanded access to their drug. There's also a concern on companies' part, even a very large pharmaceutical company, about the supply that is available to them to make available to patients in expanded access. They are not manufacturing the drug until after the drug is approved by the FDA. So they don't have a manufacturing facility set up. They don't have a manufacturing line set up. They are making this product so that it will be available to the researchers in their clinical trials. So there's a relatively small quantity that's being made that is in excess of that. So they have to ask themselves the question of, can we make enough extra of this compound to make it available to all the people who might come in here once we start making expanded access available? And the equity, the fairness of the process is of concern to them. What if we make enough and we can give this product to 10 people? But what if 20 people come in? What if 100 people come in? And all of these things are part of the calculus of making the decision to, yes, we are going to make this product available in an expanded access content. So I want to remind you that companies play a major role in expanded access. Because yes, FDA may say yes. Your doctor may say yes. And by the way, FDA has said yes. The vast majority, I think 99+% of the time that they are asked, can we get expanded access? The FDA says yes. But the big factor there, the big remaining question, as Claudia has pointed out, is the company also going to be able to say yes? Are they going to be satisfied that they can deal with the unknown risk in this larger population of people than they are enrolling in their clinical trials? Are they going to have some adverse event that could have an impact on their drug development program? What if they let this product out there in much larger numbers than they were going to be giving it to people in their clinical trials, and something happens that was completely and utterly not expected? How are they going to deal with this? What if someone dies and says, and their family or their caregivers say, this person died because they took this experimental therapy? What does the company do at that point? And of course, their legal department is all over this, which kind of explains why what Claudia was saying is true, which is that company policies, how are they going to deal with requests? What are they going to do? When are they going to say yes or no? Tend to be very vague. And it's because the last person who has reviewed this policy is the lawyer, who says you can't be too definitive because there's always going to be that moment that that thing you say is not going to happen. And then we're going to be in trouble. So companies worry about that as well. And I want to say, with respect to the impact of findings from expanded access on the company's drug development program, that FDA has repeatedly assured companies that it will never stop their development program as the result of someone having an unexpected adverse event in a clinical trial. And I believe FDA is sincere about this. But, you know, if you're that company and you're being driven to get this product out there on the market where it is going to reach the largest number of sick people, in the back of your mind, you still have this concern. You want to be fair. You want to be willing. You want to look compassionate. But yet you're a little bit terrified that something that you haven't thought of, despite all the expert advice that you get on a regular basis and during a development program, is going to happen. I think that by and large, large pharmaceutical companies have a financial and a structural organizational underpinning that helps them set up programs. And many companies have programs or departments that are devoted 100% to taking requests for expanded access, getting those requests evaluated by physicians who are knowledgeable in this disease area, by ethicists who are explaining how to do this the right way. Notwithstanding all of that, there still are going to remain those same questions. How can we do this in a way that does not have a negative impact on the ultimate goal of every drug development program, which is to get this product approved and get the product on the market so that every patient who needs it may have access to it? That is their number one priority, and that is the end of my story. Thanks, Chris, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, Kay. It's really my pleasure now to pivot us from what we labeled as the large company perspective to the small company perspective. And for that, we are fortunate to have Mr. Kenneth Moch with us. Mr. Moch has been CEO or co-founder of 5 companies that pioneered novel therapies for life-threatening diseases. His experiences as CEO of Chimerix during a global social media campaign for access to the company's experimental medicine has been widely written about. He served on the board of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO, for close to 2 decades, chairing BIO's Bioethics Committee and co-chairing the Emerging Companies Section Strategy and Policy Committee. He received an AB in biochemistry from Princeton and an MBA from Stanford. Ken, please.
Thanks so much, Chris, and thank you, everybody. And my video is on, I hope. I'm seeing yours still. But anyway, I'm here.
Yeah, we see you and you look great.
Great, fabulous. So Claudia and Chris and Kay have really set up this part of the discussion. My experiences have been very practical in expanded access. I've been involved with several companies that have run programs, and that's the perspective I bring to this. I think we have to start by a differentiating discussion, and that is that there's a big difference between what is definitionally a large pharmaceutical company and a small or smaller biotechnology company, even though they are both working on the development of new medicines. There are many, many different characteristics. The best example I can give that helps with mindsets is think about the difference between a department store, a Macy's, or whatever you want to be your department store, and a boutique on the street corner 3 miles away in a strip mall. The department store has lots of different entities with lots of different clients, and they have this thing called revenue. The boutique has limited human and financial resources. It may or may not be making money, but it's selling one thing at one time that's its specialty. And I often look at pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies in that context. I describe my experiences as not managing a P&L, but managing an L, because that's what you have. You are living in a biotech company, generally not by the results of product revenue, but rather by selling equity to investors to sustain your enterprise. I often say to people, the gardening staff of a large pharma company is bigger than most of the biotech companies I've ever been with. Kay brought up legal staff. I would add legal staff as well as gardening staff, both independently. But I think you need to think about it in those contexts, because the skill sets inside biotech companies are going to be very different and much more limited than what you find in large pharma. And so the ability to act and interact and respond to and plan is very different in those enterprises. A biotech company is not a pipeline. I describe a biotech company as a research and development pipeline unencumbered by revenue. But they're generally single lead product organizations that are working on a mission for a very specific drug or a specific technology. And that sometimes gets lost in these discussions, because if whatever you do in your risk calculation as you're developing that new experimental medicine is impacted by external forces, you can lose the product and lose the company. And well, let's take what's going on right now in this marketplace. This is the most extreme, depressed financial market I've ever seen in my 40-year career in biotech. Imagine now you're coming into this, and so at the beginning of the process, you only have one product, which is your lead, and you're trying to raise capital. And at the same time, you are getting requests for expanded access, or you already have an expanded access program. So these things need to go into the calculation. Cláudia made the comment about the understanding of risk. And the problem with risk is that it's unknown. What's going to happen in the future. Kay made the comment, and I've heard it stated many, many times, that the FDA states that they have never stopped an expanded access program or impact an expanded access program because of side effects seen during that expanded access program. And I guess I'll stop here and say I'm a big supporter of and believer in expanded access, but I do not agree with the FDA's statement about programs never being impacted. I'll leave it there. It's not for general discussion of these things, but it does happen, and you can't say it never happens. Now, it may happen just a very small percentage of the time, but it does happen, and that has to be in the risk calculation of small companies. So let's go back to what small companies have to think about. You're a single product or limited product company with limited resources, and your goal has to be, and Bio has on its website criteria for expanded access, and one of them is to get your new medicine available as quickly as possible to as many patients as possible. And that does conflict with the question of what you do about patients who want your experimental medicine now. It's the current need, the I want it right now for this patient versus the future needs of the larger patient population. And I can tell you from personal experience that nobody's out there talking about the future patients and their needs. That's not part of the calculus of experimental medicines, access to experimental medicines for life-threatening conditions now. It's even more heightened if the person who needs the experimental medicine is a child. And that's my particular experience. I can tell you from experience, and I think everybody in CUPA knows this, that if a child, and people have written, if it's a child now, people want the medicine right now. Whether or not it works or whether or not it impacts the program or what happens in the future is not necessarily part of the calculus. And that's just human nature. As a parent, I fully understand that. But as a drug developer, you have to weigh those complexities. The other thing that I often counsel companies, well, let me start with, I counsel companies to think very clearly, especially small companies, about whether or not they even want to open up an expanded access program. Because once you do, it's very hard to stop. And you need to know, therefore, what you're trying to accomplish. If it's only helping patients, that's great. How many? If you think you might learn something from the expanded access program, and by the way, you do learn things in expanded access, and I've seen that firsthand again. They can be very beneficial. But if you're doing all this stuff, you need to understand what the parameters are. My caveat is that every line is fuzzy. If you say this will only be for patients over the age of 18, you'll get sued by somebody who's 17 and a half. If you say it's only for a certain disease state with a genetic profile, somebody will come to you and say, but I have a similar genetic profile and I want it. So you need to understand up front that the desire for expanded access for life-threatening conditions will drive patients to extremes for access, and we can all understand that. But you as a drug developer have to weigh what that means for the potential developmental risk for your experimental medicine. Who is thinking about those future patients? What are the risks? And let's also be clear, expanded access is not drug development. It's something where you're making it available. You may learn things. In my personal experiences, we did learn really important things. We learned about efficacy parameters and safety profile parameters that were good. We also learned about safety profile parameters that were complex, that led to some of the issues. So this needs to be thought through. And again, if you're a small company with limited resources and you're surviving based on equity, anything that might, defined as unknown risk, slow down your developmental efforts must be a consideration as to how you decide to approach expanded access. The other thing I wanted to add is about right to try, and I'll be as blunt as I can about this. No ethical drug developing company that I know would allow their experimental medicine to be used in the expanded access, the right to try pathway. The reason is, why would you willfully go around the FDA, which approves 99+% of expanded access requests, when you know the FDA ultimately has to regulate your medicine? What's driving that question? What's driving you to do that? And I just leave that for people to think about. There are companies that make a lot of noise about we're doing this in right to try and all that stuff. I'll just say I don't get it. And I don't know any other CEO of a biotech company or pharma company that would do that, where they go around IRBs and go around the FDA. If you can't make that argument, to those regulatory enterprises and those oversight enterprises, then I wonder what you're really doing. So in conclusion, just to wrap this up, we need to, small companies in particular need to think about the parameters by which and under which they would open up an expanded access protocol and how they would define the parameters, knowing there'll be fuzzy edges. I happen to have done things with small molecules. Supply was not the issue. The issue was, in my particular antiviral case, once you opened it up for a particular viral infection, how could you say no to anybody else with that infection? And how about people with associated infections? So these things can just explode in ways that need to be considered before you start. And with that, I'll turn it back to Chris for the next introduction.
Great. Thank you so much, Ken. It's my pleasure to really bookend our conversation with a patient perspective or a patient family perspective. And for that, we have Sukhun Kang with us. Dr. Kang recently received his PhD in strategy and entrepreneurship from London Business School. Congratulations on the PhD. And is incoming assistant professor of technology management at UC Santa Barbara. His research focuses on strategy and innovation with a particular emphasis on healthcare, biopharmaceutical, and the high-tech industry. But Dr. Kang will be sharing with us today his perspective from a personal experience in seeking expanded access for a family member. Dr. Kang.
Hey, thank you, Chris. I'm not able to start my video, but I could go ahead.
That's fine. I think we've got slides and your
Sure.
voice. So if that's probably best to just keep moving forward.
Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so thank you for the introduction, Chris. My brief background is that, my wife had a triple negative breast cancer and she passed away in 2020. And we were somewhat fortunate to be able to get expanded access of 2 investigational drugs. And that was in the span of 2018 to 2019. And we faced several challenges as families with no medical background, as well as being located in Korea outside of the United States. Next slide. So since then, drawing from my experience and that me being at a business school, I started doing some research around what drives companies to do expanded access, what drives them not to engage in expanded access. So I was honorably joined CUPA as a member, and I published the article where we studied which type of companies disclose their policies on their website. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about my perspective as a caregiver for a patient who went through some conversation with the physician and the pharma companies, and also some perspectives from the international, being an international caregiver. Next slide. So I think some of the Q&A was coming through about how would you be able to convince the physician and the company about the expanded access. I think most of the times, I think I had to initiate the conversation myself. And I don't think any of the physicians have mentioned the expanded access to me, but I think I was able to figure out what the expanded access is, and I had to bring that up in my conversation with the physician. But I think there was some confusion around the terminology because I was in Korea. There's some Korean terminology that was being used for expanded access versus the compassionate use and expanded access was the larger sort of language used by the pharma companies. So and I had a chance to talk to a lot of caregivers and other patients as well. And if the physician does not mention the expanded access, I think it's less likely that patients or caregivers will mention that first. And I was one of the rare one, and I was able to spread some information to the community. However, I think the initiating the conversation was very difficult as a caregiver. Next slide. And being in Korea, where we have the national health insurance, which is really good thing. But when it comes to the cancer treatments or other serious life-threatening conditions, there's some restrictions in terms of what medical products we're going to be able to prescribe to the patients because off-label is banned in Korea, for example. And also because it has to be covered by the insurance with the tax money, not all the novel products, even if it's FDA approved, may not be FDA approved in Korea. So really leaves us with no agency in terms of making some of the decisions. It's usually handled by physicians in a way that the national health insurance is structured. Next slide. And to avoid wasting physicians' time and efforts, I think this came in Cláudia's conversation as well. I often went to the pharma's website to make sure that drugs of interest are available via expanded access. And it was usually difficult to find, right? The information was very difficult to find. And also, even if the policy is available, they were not very specific in terms of which drug or which investigation product is being provided via expanded access. Next slide. So this is a screenshot of me sending emails to the pharma companies, whether they would be able to provide expanded access. Most of the time I would get no reply, but sometimes I would luckily get a reply saying that, oh, we are not able to do this for A and B and reasons. Sometimes they were able to provide additional information. Sometimes they asked, can you move to the United States? And that was very difficult for us at the time. So there were many sort of missed opportunities here, being in Korea, as well as being trying to gain access to the disease that was very rare and hard to treat. Next slide. So in Korea, the communication often meant that I would ask physician, and then physician would go to the branch in Korea or the CRO, and then the branch in Korea or the CRO would go to the HQ in US or Europe, and then it would come back vice versa, and which took a lot of time, right? And most of the time, as you probably know, patients who may benefit from expanded access does not have that much leeway in terms of waiting for this to be finalized. So I think there was a huge administrative burden from the international perspective. Next slide. So I think I've mentioned this briefly in the prior slide. So the FDA approves takes about 1 to 2 years to get to Korea. So some never gets launched in Korea. There's a lot of reasons why. So expanded access for non-trial pre-approval access, that's happening in Korea usually meant that they were approved in the United States, but not in Korea. So those sort of readily marketed drugs in the United States, these were the typical candidates that were being provided via expanded access in Korea. This could be good since most of the drugs are very promising and sort of it has been tested, but at the same time, it meant that most of the novel treatment options in the phase 1 and 2 were not an option in Korea. Next slide. This might be it. So thanks for listening to my story, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer.
Well, thank you. I'll now invite all the panelists to turn on their cameras, and we have 11 questions, and more might flow in, and we have 12 minutes. So let me start us right off the bat by trying to cluster 2 of these questions together that are really asking for more practical advice about how to approach companies. One is from a physician's perspective, if they want to help a patient approach a company about this, and another is from a patient's perspective for a company that has announced they're launching a phase 2 trial, but they won't even ask them to set up an expanded access program. Do any of the panelists have advice, like in practicalities, how to get on the agenda for in either setting as a physician or a patient?
Happy to comment. I think reaching out to the patient advocacy function in the company is the ideal approach. They should be well prepared for answering this type of questions. If a company is too small and doesn't have that function yet, if it's a real baby company, I think reaching out directly to the CEO, preferably with a letter stating your interest and looking for some type of guidance on communication can be effective.
What do you think, Ken, about letters to the CEO?
No, I think that's actually a good idea. I also think that in this day and age, most biotech company CEOs do know what expanded access is. I don't think there's any company that's a realistically funded company developing a novel and important medicine doesn't know about expanded access, and they've probably already made some decisions about whether or not to have a program available. So reaching to the CEO is a good idea. Doesn't always mean you're going to get an answer, and there are lots of things that may not happen in response, but that's probably the best access point, or the chief medical officer, but CEO is just fine. I also think that, again, people need to understand there's an absolute right in these companies to say not at this time for their medicine. It may not be the right time for any set of reasons. I don't necessarily love the idea Cláudia brought up about appealing, because I think that just creates more complexities. The answer is we don't think at this time it's available, can be made available, is within the rights of a small company for whatever set of reasons. But that's a debatable question we can have. I don't think people should be appealing by lawsuits, for example.
Does anyone have much? Lawsuits have been mentioned a few times. Is anyone aware of this? Have there been substantial numbers of lawsuits in this space, either for bad outcomes or for lack of access that someone wants? I'm not aware of many actually filed.
Well, there was the Abigail Alliance. You know better than I do about that. But I don't see that. I see more social media approaches, shall we say, which rises to the level of threats at times. But I see that more in conversations I've had.
Well, speaking of the law, we have another question asking about the law that requires companies to post their policies on expanded access. What can be done to make them comply with the law?
They should.
I think that's a tough question. I saw that question and I thought, oh, maybe Chris will skip this one. I mean, you don't want to, you can't shut the company's development program down. I mean, that would be a disadvantage to every, I think that maybe, and how this would work, and FDA is probably pounding its head against the wall as I even speak. I think embarrassing the company is probably the best way to go and see how far you get with that. I do think that many, if not most, large companies have posted something somewhere. They have either posted on their own website, and as Cláudia points out, sometimes if you search expanded access, it will pop right up. Other times, not so much. Or they have posted on the navigator of the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which is reaganudall.org. And you can search navigator directly. And the companies have posted there. Those policies tend to be, especially for big companies, because they do have a larger law department than the people that do their landscaping. They do tend to be rather vague, but in my experience looking at them, at least they point you somewhere. So you've got, lots and lots of people in the leadership at a big company, and only one of them is the person who actually is taking these phone calls. So to be pointed in that direction and then try to get rid of some of the lack of clarity by an actual one-on-one conversation, I think is the way to go. But it is a tricky question because the law does require these policies to be made available publicly.
But
and if they're not,
add though that the law doesn't require you to actually grant access. So
correct.
No, it does not.
The company probably doesn't have a program, so you could shame them to saying explicitly they don't have a program.
Yeah.
But that's not really be helpful.
I think, we've talked about this internally just for the group, and CUPA, I hope, will move forward with creating a draft policy that says we don't have it available at this time. I've certainly done that in some of my early stage companies, even before phase 2, just to say, because I was in Alzheimer's for a while, just to say we don't have it available, and that's fair. I think that the question of companies that have made their experimental medicine available on kind of one-offs, and I think everybody on this phone call has, probably lots of people have gotten calls from friends or physicians or billionaires asking for access, and that one-off issue, should social media or friendship or any of these things be a one-off reason for access to an experimental medicine, is an ethical question that we all have to deal with. But I think in the black and white of yes or no, we can get more companies to say no. I don't think shaming is going to get them to any other place, but that's okay.
Well, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the idea of group protocols. And a question is coming in asking about what are the best practices for protocol-based EAP? Is it easier to have a single patient EAP? What makes it challenging to do intermediate or large size EAPs? Can anyone speak to that approach?
I'm not sure what the question is, having done all of those. We started off at Chimerix with single patient. When it got to 200 or so, the FDA asked that we convert it to an intermediate size protocol. But it depends on what you're able to do and willing to do as a small organization. The FDA does not make this hard. I mean, that's one of the things that I most dislike about, for those of you who like the Goldwater Institute's approaches, I find it objectionable, but the FDA doesn't make this hard. Dealing with physicians was never hard. I had 5 people working on an expanded access program. The only problem was making sure you had the resources to develop your drug for its main purpose. And those are the complexities of a small company I've already talked about. But the protocols aren't hard. It's just a matter of what you want to set as the parameters.
Well, another question comes in asking about whether companies should really plan from the beginning as part of the drug development program to offer expanded access and to have enough supply, for example, to do so. Should this become normalized as part of the drug development process, investment, planning, scaling?
Yes, it should become normalized. And I think a lot of companies do that now. And I think in particular, I have seen this happening with smaller companies who are developing products for people with rare diseases. They are thinking ahead about, we've got this, it's the first ever for this small population, admittedly. Let's figure out how to do our clinical trials and at the same time make this investigational compound available more or less even across the board. So open label trials, for instance, is one way that they do that. But I do think companies are thinking ahead, certainly more than they were 10 years ago. And I want to say, I keep hearing about the right to try law and of course the law that requires companies to post their policies. I think it's important to remember that the same thing happens in Congress as happens everywhere, which is Congress becomes aware of a problem and then immediately wants to solve that problem because of publicity. So they read the headlines, they see social media, they get people marching on the Capitol and whatever. And this is not the best way to navigate the ship, in my opinion.
Can I add something? Kay has just caused me to modify a sentence I made before, which was when I said expanded access is not drug development. I think for gene therapy companies and other genetically targeted organizations that are companies that are raising limited amounts of capital to start, expanded access is being used as part of the drug development process to give them information about how earlier in the development stages, patients respond to their medicine. So I do think that that blurry line is of what is clinical development and what is expanded access, and what you can learn from expanded access is changing. And if you think about it from an investor perspective, if you said to an investor, we're gonna dedicate X% of the capital we raise from you for expanded access, and it's not going to benefit our program in any way, they would probably not be supportive of that because it's not the use of their capital. But if you say we're going to use it in expanded access to learn things about the drug, which can be helpful, then they will be supportive. So you need to look at the economic underpinnings of some of the earlier stage biotech companies, which again, don't have revenue, to think about how that equation is balanced in their developmental processes.
I'm glad you mentioned gene therapy because that was one of our questions. But another question comes in around the Act for ALS. And it's worth us mentioning that that's been a development in Congress to actually provide grants for expanded access. Would any of the panelists like to speak to that particular application to ALS, or whether that's a good model for expanding to other diseases as well?
Come on, guys. Remember Operation Warp Speed and the question, where's my Operation Warp Speed? I think this is, a political lobbying group for good reasons. This happened in Alzheimer's as well, has caused a certain amount of capital to be allocated to a particularly complex and horrible disease. There are lots of complex and horrible diseases, and the question is, you know, it's a model, it's funding it. A lot of companies can't afford it, so it does provide funding. And I'm not a specialist on this particular legislation, but there are a lot of other diseases that have equal needs for different patient populations. So are we talking ethics? Are we talking economics? Are we talking politics? I guess that's the question I'd throw back into the mix.
Well, that is the challenge for a lot of this field, is the intersection of economics and ethics and law to serve such a profound need in the broader population, both in the short term and the long term. And so I think I'll leave it there. We are at the top of the hour. I want to thank our panelists and the attendees for coming today and for your excellent questions. We will be following up with more answers and via email to those who attended. A recording of the event will be sent within a week. We'll trim off the edges a little bit and make it available on YouTube. And we've already posted the way to find it in the chat. Keep an eye out for our resource page and glossary of terms take-homes, which will be sent shortly following today's event. I would be happy to receive emails or follow me on Twitter. If you should have any questions or concern or wish to collaborate with CUPA, please reach out to our program coordinator, John Massarelli, whose email is also in the chat. On behalf of all the panelists, let us thank John for herding cats, making this the smooth program that it was. Thank you, John, really behind the scenes, making it all happen. And a final thank you to Bionicle EMAS for sponsoring the live translation during today's event. And you can see their name and logo on this final slide. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next year.